It's me, Mario! Hello!
Hola, comrades! Today's topic of interest, Mario 64. It's hard to fathom how different the gaming landscape was just over 20 years ago. Everyone was nervous about the jump to 3D. The SNES and the Genesis ruled the world. When Nintendo announced the N64, it was received with applause, but also with trepidation. How exactly was this going to work? How would video games work in 3 dimensions? And not this faux Mode 7 3D, but real, actual 3D. A fully realized polygonal world. How in the name of Shigeru Miyamoto was this going to work? And this new experimental console was launching with a Mario game. How in the world do you convert the side-scrolling 2D platforming perfection of Mario to a 3D world? I realize that all these questions seem quite hilarious in hindsight. If you're a newer gamer, it's almost impossible to imagine a world in which there weren't 3D Mario games. But that's how it was back then. The jump from 2D to 3D was hard. Many of the great franchises of the 2D era didn't make the jump into 3D, and their names have since faded into obscurity. There were so many terrible games made in the late 90s, when developers struggled to learn the rules of a new gaming landscape. These games were glitchy, ugly, and dull. They were disgraceful. And it wasn't like today, where you can make 2D retro games and still command widespread acclaim. No, back in the late 90s, making anything that wasn't 3D was the equivalent of traveling from New York to Boston on horseback to deliver someone's mail. Developers doubled down on 3D, resulting in a handful of successes amidst a sea of failures. Even these successes were mostly mediocre. You play these games and you shake your head at how far they were from where we are now. Mario's chief rival, Sonic the Hedgehog, managed to make the transition, thankfully, but while the Sonic Adventure games are great, they never reached the same level of critical acclaim as the original Genesis trilogy, and even as an apologist for the 3D Sonic games, I will admit that the transition left the series grasping for an identity. Being the preeminent 2D franchise, Mario should have struggled to fit into this new gaming landscape too. There's a wide rift between 2D gaming and 3D gaming. The Sonic path should have been the best case scenario. Instead, Mario 64 not only became the best game in the history of the franchise, but set a gold standard for 3D gaming. How do you transfer the Mario experience to 3D? This is a hard question, but Shigeru Miyamoto and company made it look effortless. While Mario 64 has some rough patches, especially concerning the camera, it's just as playable today as it was 20 years ago. This is infinitely commendable. Nintendo is not the coolest kid on the block anymore, and they've thankfully stopped trying to be. They're doing well for themselves, but they're not constantly, consistently redefining the gaming landscape because there's nothing much to redefine. Gaming isn't about graphics or hardware anymore, and it's also not about gimmicks or playstyles. It's about what it should have always been about. The games. Even consoles don't matter as much as they used to, so it's unlikely that Nintendo is going to revolutionize the gaming landscape again in any meaningful way. But it's hard to overstate how important they were to the foundation of gaming. Without them, gaming would not be what it is today. Revolutionizing 2D gaming wasn't enough for them. They had to revolutionize 3D gaming too. The pinnacle of early 3D Nintendo was Ocarina of Time, one of the first true masterpieces of gaming, but Ocarina built off the lessons of Mario 64. Just as Ocarina was a major break from A Link to the Past, so is 64 a huge break from Super Mario World. Sure, narratively the games aren't that different from their predecessors. For The Legend of Zelda, it's about defeating the evil Ganondorf and rescuing Zelda and the realm. For Mario, it's even simpler. Zelda, at least, has a compelling high fantasy mythos. In Mario games, the story is as simple as rescue Princess Peach from the clutches of the evil Bowser, and hope that she bakes you a cake afterward. But how these basic concepts are executed matters. Ocarina was significantly more story-driven than A Link to the Past, and it put more of an emphasis on character development than its predecessor. Mario 64 goes even further and changes the entire structure of the gameplay when compared to Super Mario World. It's not about completing levels before the timer goes off anymore and collecting as many points as you can. It's about exploring these miniature worlds and finding stars. Once you have enough stars, you can confront Bowser. Many of these stars are located in unexpected places, and you have to hunt them down. To collect them all, you have to master a wide variety of pursuits, from nimble platforming to beating a penguin in a race. No, I'm not kidding. A penguin. It was a radical reinvention of the series, but somehow it seemed completely natural. These games are exactly where the Mario magic starts as far as I'm concerned. They're where you're finally given a chance to engage with the Mario world. They have more in common with Zelda games than 2D Mario platformers, and yet they never feel like Zelda ripoffs. This is what Mario games in 3D are like, Nintendo said, and instead of arguing or shouting or yearning for the past like so many manic, rabid fans have a tendency to do, we accepted it without complaint because it just felt so right. It just made so much sense. Mario 64 did not cause a gaming revolution because it inspired more 3D platformers, although it did. Some good, some bad. No, Mario 64 caused a gaming revolution because it fundamentally shifted our understanding of what gaming could be. Video games are a new medium, yes, but they weren't that new by the late 90s. For decades, we had it pummeled into our heads that video games were supposed to be a certain way. Poor graphics, 2D, and relatively simple. Well, Mario 64 did not change that perception overnight. It did more to shift that perception than any other game. It navigated the ship of gaming through the choppy waters of the transition from 2D to 3D and led it into the bright sun and cool breezes of the future. I wouldn't say this is my favorite game of all time. In fact, it probably wouldn't even rank on my top 20. But if you asked me to choose one, just one game, that was integral to the development of the gaming landscape as we know it today, I would have to say Mario 64. It's an exciting time in gaming. The industry is growing and diversifying, and that can only mean good things artistically. If you want to talk about the golden age of gaming, don't talk about the 80s or 90s. Talk about right now. But as we move forward, it's important to pay respect to the games that got us to where we are, and I can hardly think of a game more deserving of focus than Mario 64. On behalf of all of us, I'd like to say thank you, Mario 64. You were great 20 years ago, and you're still great today. I had to throw this episode together in short notice. I hope it turns out okay. I'm even busier than I expected, and that is saying something. But it's always nice to talk about classic games. It's remarkable that what was made 20 years ago on hardware that could hardly show rudimentary polygons can still be so influential today. I hope you've enjoyed the different sorts of videos I've been releasing as of late, by the way. My main focus is on games, but I'm the kind of person who is willing to talk about anything from Yuri on Ice to Taylor Swift. The world's too big and too interesting to only discuss one medium. Anyway, if you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more super stellar content. Also, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that uber cool stuff. Adios, comrades!